cynicism as they were, he needed to see something firsthand. Just as a scientist needs proof and doesn't rely on faith, that was Thomas. He needed to see something firsthand. Thomas, because of that analytical mind and that way of processing, he was often in charge of the itinerary for the disciples. He set their schedules, what kind of work they were going to do, where they were going to go. He helped coordinate that. And of all the disciples, he probably had the best intellectual understanding of Jesus. And Thomas had an appreciation for Christ because Thomas was somewhat emotional, as we'll talk about in a minute. But what he loved about Jesus is how Jesus could, in one sense, be full of grace and mercy. And in another sense, Jesus stood firm. He was almost rigid in terms of when he was standing up for justice, standing up for something that God had him to say. He was rigid. He was forthright in standing up for that. And Thomas really admired how Jesus could do both and do it so effortlessly. Thomas was often thought of as gloomy. He was thought of as somebody who was disagreeable and even quarrelsome. And part of that is because of his upbringing. His parents did not have a great marriage. They at times did not want to be married. So certainly he experienced quarreling as he grew up, and that had an effect on him as he grew up. And Thomas, again, his emotions would swing. He had sometimes very bad days where he was very sad and very down. Another thing that affected him, his twin sister died when she was 9. So he had some difficult things going through his life that affected his mood. And maybe because of that, he tended to be more cautious. He was always kind of a safety first person. Of course, the disciples weren't like that typically. The disciples were oftentimes forge ahead at whatever the cost. Thomas was always a safety first type of a guy, and when they would vote on what they would do, oftentimes Thomas got outvoted because the disciples wanted to plunge ahead despite the risk, and Thomas tended to be more cautious. And yet, in spite of that, whatever the cause was, whatever the group voted on, regardless of how dangerous it was, Thomas was one of the first, if not the first, to say, let's go. In spite of his cautiousness, he was also tremendously brave. He struggled throughout with those periods of feeling down and struggling, and yet he always seemed to rally that courage, rally that faith that he had in Jesus to pull himself up to be one of the first to lead, the first to be ready to go wherever Jesus called him to go. And Thomas was really a litmus test, so to speak, for Jesus' ministry. Because one of Thomas's greatest traits, he was tremendously honest, tremendously loyal, tremendously genuine. And it was thought that with Thomas, had Jesus' ministry not been authentic, had it not been exactly what it claimed to be, Thomas wouldn't have stayed. Because that was one of his most important traits, was that honesty, that genuineness. And what he showed, one of the things that Thomas teaches us, he did doubt. He did have his struggles. He did have his down days. But he was also an example for those people who struggle. And we all do. We all have days where we doubt our faith. We doubt where Christ is leading us. We doubt where things are going. We maybe have days where we just don't feel like moving forward. What Thomas taught us was we trust. He trusted, and it was because of that faith and that trust that when he was feeling down, when he was feeling unsure about what the mission was, he trusted. He put his faith in Christ and plunged ahead. And what a great example he sets for us when we have those days where we just don't feel like moving. We just are not sure the path we're going on, if it's the right one. To trust. To put that trust in Christ, that he will lead us where we need to go. And Thomas definitely had that. And then there's Matthew, the 7th apostle chosen, or disciple chosen by Andrew. And of course we know Matthew as the businessman, the tax collector. And certainly he was gifted at that. But he also had an ability to make friends. He had an ability to kind of get along with all kinds of people, which would make sense because as a tax collector, certainly you're dealing with all kinds of people, and maybe not always people. Typically, people weren't happy to see the tax collector coming, so he had the ability to work with people. No surprise, Andrew appointed him as their financial advisor, their financial person in charge of raising funds for the disciples. So that makes sense. And of course, the thing that Matthew appreciated most about Jesus was Jesus' forgiveness. The forgiveness he gave to people. I mean, clearly, when Thomas joined the group, he probably wasn't real welcomed. He was a tax collector. He had put burdens on many of the disciples. And so Thomas really appreciated how Jesus welcomed him and how Jesus was able to be forgiving of people. The disciples eventually came around. They actually even became to where they were proud of the things Thomas did. But it took some time because clearly, of all the disciples, he might have been one of the most outcast of the group. He was a shrewd politician, which maybe isn't all that surprising, and he was in charge of raising funds, making sure that the ministry had enough money to continue on their way. What nobody knows, he gave practically all of his money to the cause of the ministry, to provide food, to provide, whatever they needed to sustain themselves. Thomas, and he wasn't wealthy, but he had a decent fortune. Certainly was probably more financially solid than any of the other disciples, and he provided for the group, but never shared that with anyone, although Jesus knew. When he gave money, he gave it in somebody else's name, because he was afraid that if he gave the money, again, given how he was viewed as a tax collector, the fear was that if he gave it in his name, the disciples might have felt the money was tainted and not take it. So when he gave, he would give it in somebody else's name. He was very reluctant to give in his name. But he never shared it with the disciples. And what's really impressive about that, there were times, of course, when the disciples probably didn't treat him the best, especially early on. And Matthew had to have times where he just wanted to say, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't be eating. Because many times that was the case. His money provided the basic, the daily bread that they needed. And yet he held back. He never mentioned that to the disciples. Even when it got intense where, as the disciples would argue, and certainly he was a prime target to maybe be picked on because of his past occupation. In spite of all that, in spite of the tremendous pressure and the desire, and we've all been there, we want to tell people, well, you know what I did for you? You owe me one. Thomas never did that. He kept that. I'm sorry, I keep saying Thomas. Matthew, thank you. Matthew. Yes, you know who I'm talking about, fortunately. Matthew, thank you. Matthew took that to his grave. Matthew, as much as he wanted to tell the disciples that it was he that was supporting him, he kept that to himself. The disciples all died without knowing what Matthew had done for them. But Jesus knew. And what a great example for all of us, because how often when we do something for someone, we kind of want them to know, look what I did for you. And certainly in his position, Matthew would have maybe wanted to share that more. He was trying to fit in, and yet he kept that to himself. It was his way of honoring Jesus. It was his way of honoring the disciples, providing for them selflessly. And so these two apostles, these two disciples, Thomas and Matthew, certainly set such great examples for us. Thomas, in spite of his fear, in spite of his concern about moving forward, in spite of even being rejected, Thomas never held a grudge. He continued to serve Christ in whatever role he was needed. And Matthew, in spite of being the outcast, provided so much for the disciples and did not ask for any recognition from it. A great lesson for all of us. And all God's children said, Amen.